Hey everybody, this is Jon Croft with Cultural Warfare with Jon Croft, and I am Jon Croft. And how are you doing? Rebecca's here today.
Hi, Jon Croft.
Hi. Well, this is our second attempt. Our other attempt failed utterly because I was worn out. And what else happened? Oh yeah, we got a power outage and it interrupted what we were doing on Friday night.
And
And
it dissolved into hilarity.
it did. It dissolved in hilarity. And then we were just like, let's do this another time. It was kind of funny. There might be, I don't think there's a recording that I kept. I think I erased the recording too, so nobody will ever see it. That's okay. Um, but yeah, so tonight we're going to be talking about Trump a little bit, and we're going to talk about a few other things. Did you have any media experiences?
I did. Yeah, we've been experiencing the Chronicles of Narnia a
Yeah.
lot this past week. We listened to The Magician's Nephew
Hmm.
as an audiobook, which we found on YouTube, which was awesome. And we just listened to the whole thing, and it was great. And my daughter had just finished reading it. And then we've been watching the Narnia movies. And so The Magician's Nephew is basically a prequel to the whole series. So it's
Hmm.
it's the set that we have, it's called number one, and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is called number two.
Hmm.
Although it's really not the first in the series, it's really just the prequel. So it was really good. They're all really, really consistently good.
Oh yeah.
And at the same time, she was reading the books, um, and she finished the last one, which is called The Last Battle. And she read this quote to me from it. It was so good, I just had to share it. So this is a quote from the end,
Hmm.
and this is Aslan speaking. He says, "The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning." And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter one of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before.
Yeah.
I love that. I thought
It's
that was so powerful. There's like, I think there's something inside of all of us that just knows that there's something better that can't even be put into words.
hmm.
And I love the way C.S. Lewis is always kind of referring to that like internal hope or that internal joy that's kind of mysterious that you don't really know what it means or where it came from, but it has
Yeah.
something to do with childhood and eternity. And
Yeah.
um, I just
Yeah.
wanted
I
to share
think that
that.
that notion of eternity is kind of what I think what sets human beings apart, um, in the sense that we can conceive of eternity. So like the
Yeah,
human mind, the human heart can kind of conceive of eternity and kind of hand in hand we kind of believe in eternity.
yeah,
Um, And so that I think that goes very well with that notion of that C.S. Lewis was speaking of there, of these things that are too great to speak of, or too great to even understand how great they are.
yeah,
Because if you could understand it, you could speak about it. And so the idea that you can't speak about something is like implying that it's too great for your understanding.
yeah.
No. And so I think that's a beautiful notion. And I think it's very real. So he was speaking of something real there. And I think Tolkien also, when I think we mentioned this before too, that um, like the first Chronicles book, right, which wasn't really the first one, but the origin story, essentially, the magician's nephew, where it speaks of the earth being sung into being, or that world being Narnia being sung into being, and
Yeah,
how Tolkien has the same thing in his Silmarillion.
right.
Um, there's this beauty in all of that, in the creation of these universes, and then in the eternal existence of them in the heart of man. That's really fascinating, and it speaks of something deeper than just the philosophies that you find in the world. You
Yeah,
know, it's something more enduring and deep than that. So I
yeah,
love that. Yeah, it's great, great stuff.
yeah.
Um,
So Christians have been talking about the Chronicles of Narnia for a while, but there's a reason they're really, really, really good.
yeah, and you were mentioning that as your media experience, and I
Yeah,
I myself thought about Narnia a little bit because of Greta Gerwig being in the news, and the fact that I still oppose the idea of her directing the next Chronicles of Narnia, because she's primarily known in Hollywood as a feminist director, and she made Barbie and these other feminist films. And so the idea that she would be directing this extremely explicitly Christian story, um, I think is not a good thing. It's not a good match, right? But it could be that similarly to the Tolkien estate, that the C.S. Lewis, the people who govern his foundation, are thinking not of their legacy, but thinking of the money they can make, if they give the rights to Netflix and Greta Gerwig, they'll make more money. So this is it's kind of a disturbing reality to realize that these authors that write such beautiful, profound things, that their legacy is being kind of, some people are wiping their feet on their legacy, treating it as a doormat, so they can make money. And so you know, I think that people need to oppose the match between Netflix and Chronicles of Narnia, and I think that, you know, I think it's a bad idea. These ideas, I don't think they're going to make it into the final. I mean, if you look at the what Amazon did to Lord of the Rings, you know, when they disregard his legacy. They even say things like, "Oh, there's no canon," or we need to um deviate. And then they acknowledge it and say, "Well, we need to deviate from the canon in other places." To update it, give it an update. What does that even mean? Give it an update. I mean, it's absurd. Um, but we live in this absurd, bizarro, backwards land right now where we get to just like pretend that we are telling Chronicles of Narnia, and then just put a label on it and sell it to people as though it's the Chronicles of Narnia, but it's not. And they get to sell Tolkien's name and put it out there, but it's not Tolkien. And why is this? Because there's no new original ideas. So, and this is because they don't want new original ideas, because you can't make a blockbuster movie on new original ideas. So they need some built-in audience that they can use, right? Kind of pretend that the audience is getting a certain thing, and then you get the bait and switch, right? You bait and switch the audience, into believing that this is a Tolkien or a C.S. Lewis or a this, and they were just using the name, the property, the IP. They treat it as IP. It's just property. It's just a thing. It's just content to make money on. It's not like someone's dreams and goals and wishes and beautiful storytelling that shouldn't be, mangled and, it should be listened to and appreciated and understood and, beautified, you know, and protected, if it's valuable. I mean, don't you think? So, um, so that's one of my complaints is that Greta Gerwig will be heading this project up. I mean, these are beautiful stories that kids like. This is not appropriate for kids, you know. So for someone like Greta Gerwig to be making the film. But yeah, looks like they're still doing the deal with Netflix, and that Netflix is even going to possibly to be doing a theatrical release, which Netflix is not known for doing. So instead of kind of like unceremoniously dumping it on the platform, which they generally do, they're going to be making a big deal out of this project instead. They're going to be putting it up on IMAX screens, probably. And that's what they say they'll be doing at least. Um, and so we're going to be getting Greta Gerwig's version of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia in on big IMAX screens, you know, and people will probably pay for it anyway, you know.
Well, I have hope, and it feels like they're wanting to maybe imitate Angel Studios a little bit. They're doing the Christian content and they're releasing it in theaters, just like Angel
Hmm.
releases their Christian content in theaters.
Some of it, yeah, the big stuff, right?
So I have hope that that the story will shine through. The truth of the story will shine through. And
Yeah.
maybe even in the production meetings, some people's hearts will be moved. That's how much I believe in the stories. I think you can
Yeah.
read the stories and have your imagination baptized
Mm.
and be um I don't know, be made sensitive, maybe be made open to God.
You have much faith
All things are possible.
in Hollywood. I don't have faith in Hollywood in that way. I mean, look, Darren Aronofsky did Noah, and reading that story of Noah didn't change him one whit when he made that film. We're talking about Hollywood here, and I think the Bible it talks about your conscience being seared with a hot iron. That's what we're talking about here,
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
my
my hope
view.
is not in Hollywood, it's in him.
Yeah. So, obviously, I hope that Scripture will change many people in Hollywood as well.
Yeah.
Um, but they they can ignore it if they want, and
Hmm.
that's. So yes, we could certainly pray.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, many people are praying that Donald Trump will change our whole country, right, and reform Hollywood even to the degree of reforming Hollywood. But
Mm.
look, I'm not going to say that this is impossible. Okay. I'm not going to say that um, it can't happen. I mean, before the guy's even inaugurated, they already do a ceasefire in Syria and in Israel. They're like, let's seize this war in Israel, right? So having someone like Donald Trump in office does change people. It does make people go, okay, wait a second. Like, because he governs with a different philosophy than the previous people who were in office. There's a different philosophy there, right? And so, um, I'm not saying it doesn't have an impact. Obviously, it does. Um, so let's talk about a little bit Trump and Hollywood, the relationship there, because the news is basically that Trump has appointed. It's like he's like he created this office, which doesn't really exist, but it's like the office of being an ambassador to Hollywood, basically. He appoints Mel Gibson, Jon Voight, and Sylvester Stallone to be ambassadors to Hollywood to kind of like try to steer Hollywood back in a good direction.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. And I mean, frankly, if you want to reform a place like Hollywood, having film people do that is smart. Having people who have been in film for decades, who are Oscar winners, Oscar, award nominated, obviously, as well. And, you know, they're all unique people as well. Each of them are whether it's Stallone or um, Gibson, they both have made films. Gibson's more of the director, but Stallone is a writer, he's an actor, he's a director, he's a producer. Stallone has done a lot. Um, Gibson is more of an actor and a director, and Voight is more of an actor and a producer. So they all have kind of a unique, and Voight's probably the most actor of all of them in a way. Um, because he's more of like, Academy. I think he was the Academy Award winner of the three. But no, I think actually Braveheart won the Academy Award, didn't it? And
Oh,
Gibson
yeah.
directed that, so and acted in it. So all of these guys are eminently talented and respected by Hollywood as it comes to the craft, not as it comes to the politics, but as it comes to the craft, they're eminently respected. And I don't think anybody can throw shade at that. So they're above reproach, right? And so these are really smart choices. I mean, you could say, right 5 years ago, Mel Gibson was not above reproach, right? Because of his anti-Semitic rant he went on, like, I don't know, a decade ago or something,
That
a
was so
while
weird.
ago. That was so long ago. Go ahead.
I just said that was so weird.
Yeah, well, he was drunk when he did it.
It's just that's even weirder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you watch his life a little bit, he was an alcoholic, and you'll say a lot of stuff when you're drunk. But
Hmm.
like he, he reformed, he got off of drinking, he became, you know, someone who cares about that, and it's part of his life now, and he calls himself an alcoholic, that like, and so who needs to stay dry, needs to stay clean. So that you can succumb under ridicule, or you can make something of yourself from
Yeah.
that, you know and I don't think Hollywood can hate him for the anti-Semitism either, because it's been shown in the last year or two that they're pretty anti-Semitic themselves. So, or at least the Democratic Party is pretty bad themselves. So, they've defended a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric in the last year, since what happened in Israel with the Gaza Strip. So now there would be hypocrites to call him an anti-Semite, wouldn't they? Um, but so Mel Gibson now gets a free pass thanks to that, thanks to them dropping the ball and becoming racists. Um, so we have three men that are above reproach now going to Hollywood saying, "There's a problem." What, when have we last seen this? And maybe, well, maybe instead of when have we last seen it, what examples do we see in history of this happening in Hollywood? Well, the Hays Code, um, was going on in the 1930s, and the Hays Code was is a very similar situation to what we have today. So you have the pre-code era and you have the post-code era. The code was written by some Christian and Catholic dudes and who belonged to a group of people a group of Catholics primarily. I think they were called the something of decency. They were like a group of guys who were like, we are going to pledge to not see indecent Hollywood films. And they would line up in thousands of people and pledge that they're not going to see indecent Hollywood films.
When
This
was
is going to
this?
make a big difference when you have thousands and thousands of people standing up against indecency in Hollywood.
Wow.
That's how you make a difference. And so this happens, and what happens, Hollywood starts to panic a little bit and go, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to get this money back, that we've lost because our reputation is being lost around the country because there was essentially a big backlash, right, culturally that occurred because of the Roaring Twenties, right? The Roaring Twenties was seen universally now as a decadent era of immorality, essentially, and which also, by the way, affected Weimar Germany and made Germany what it eventually became, which was a decadent, immoral place. And so the fascists backlashed against that, against communist decadence and immorality. And then fascism came from that, which was a strong pendulum swing backswing towards kind of like pro-German thinking, right? So I'm not saying their thinking was good at all. In fact, I don't even necessarily agree with the Hays Code or anything like that. What I think is that when you go too far with decadence, there's going to be a backlash.
Mm.
That's just take my advice. Don't think that you can just do whatever you want and it's not going to affect people. It's going to affect people. So this is what Hollywood is going to have to wrap their brains around, right? You can't just do whatever you want, and people are going to do something about it. So you get these thousands of men. I think it was literally 20,000 men who were like, I will not watch an indecent Hollywood picture. And so what does Hollywood do? They they have to improve their image, right? They know that number one, if they don't do something, this group of guys could influence. It's not just these guys, right? It's culture in general, right? The culture could influence Washington, D.C. to bring about censorship in Hollywood. You know, that was totally a possibility, right, at the time. And so, um, uh, what does Hollywood do? Hollywood gets smart and they realize, well, we don't want to be regulated from the outside. That means we have to regulate from the inside. And the only way these people who don't like what we've been doing is going to believe we can
Mm.
regulate from the inside is to hire ourselves an upstanding dude who's highly respected in the conservative community. So they get this guy named, I think it was William Hayes. Well, Hayes is his name. And he's a Presbyterian elder, and he is highly respected both in Hollywood and in DC and with the communities around the country.
Hmm.
So what he does, he's a lobbyist also in DC, and he makes tons of money from Hollywood, who's helping him, right? Helping him be the face of reformed Hollywood, right? So they're going to be reformed now. And how do they do that? Well, they adopt what's called the Hays Code. And the Hays Code was written by, I think, two guys. And Hayes supported it, of course. And Hayes was sent to implement it in Hollywood. And so this is private industry regulating itself with a code of ethics. And so when you have a code of ethics, you put it out there and you say this is your goal, this is what you're trying to do. And if people believe you, then they're not going to come down on you, right? With some kind of crime and punishment. So uh like what's possibly going to happen in Hollywood is if Hollywood doesn't do something, they're going to lose millions of dollars. So they have to do this. They have to do the Hays Code. But of course, what you end up with then is you end up with two groups of people, the reformers, and you get the people in Hollywood who don't want to be reformed. They want to push back against this reform. And that's what you're going to get with Trump's appointees as well. You're going to get people who push back in Hollywood, and they're going to push back hard, right? So these are back to the 30s, right? When the Hays Code is being talked about, what do you get? You get a bunch of industry types in Hollywood who push back. Would you think that the studios would do that? Yeah, you'd think the studio heads, and it's not that they didn't push back, but what do they have to do? They have to reform their image. So they're not going to push back, right? It wouldn't be very smart of them to do that because now they're going to lose. They're going to lose their real customer. So who pushes back? The the newspapers and the trades, the journalists in Hollywood. They're the ones who push back. They're the ones who are what they want to see is what they think of as art, right? So what they think of as art, they're fine with Marlene Dietrich doing a bunch of weird stuff. They're fine with all these Mae West taking her clothes off. They're fine with all that stuff. What they don't want is someone coming in from the outside and challenging them on their morality. They don't want that. So, and that's again what you're going to see happening in Hollywood against Trump's appointed people, right? That's what you're going to see. So, um, what happens? Well, sure, they push back, but I mean, guess what? At the time, there was bigger budget films that became big, and there was films that remained small. And so the Hays Code, what it did is it rode this line between we're going to help Hollywood, but we're also going to help our customer. And it might not have stayed what it is forever because after World War II, things started pushing back in the opposite direction even more, and there was lots of concerns that Hollywood would lose money, et cetera, if they keep doing this. But guess what? The film Gone with the Wind, when what was the primary thing that a lot of people remember from that film?
The filthy language.
Yeah, one thing the guy says, I don't give a damn. It's like the end of the film. So the fact is, it affected the public consciousness to such a degree that people didn't even want to hear one damn word. I'm sorry, the truth is there was films before that that were terrible, terrible. Nobody seemed to care, right, in Hollywood. But as things start reforming, what do you see? A lot of talk that's overt and where people say, "Is this rude? Is this crude? Let's talk about it." Right? Sure, a lot of that talk is going to just make you want to watch the film. Well, exactly. So having a code of ethics doesn't necessarily, even though people disagree with that code and think it's a bunch of hoity-toity religious types imposing their will on people, which is not happening. They're not imposing their will. This is a private code of ethics. You're not going to go to prison if you don't follow it. It's not, nobody's imposing it on you, but it kind of is, isn't it? It kind of is being imposed on you. Why? Because of the discussion. And as you have the discussion, you don't want to be on the bad end of that stick, right? So sure, you can rail against the Hays Code and you can rail against puritanical America, but restrictions like this don't necessarily aren't necessarily a bad thing for the art form. In fact, people talk about all the time how an artist has to have limitations, has to have restrictions on themselves. If they get everything that they need to make whatever they want, this in many ways stunts creativity, right? And is it easy for a stand-up comedian to do clean comedy? That's not easy to do clean comedy. They say it's one of the hardest things is to actually do really good, clean comedy. So are you just railing against Christian people or are you railing against the fact that it's hard for you to do that? So are you an artist? Are you a good comedian or not? Let's stand up to the challenge. Do you really need nude ladies in your movie from the 20s? Flapper dancers to make a good story? No, you don't. Do you need sex scenes and stuff? Do you need bad language to make a good story? No, you don't. So, a lot of these guys that came up with the Hays Code, and this is kind of the tragic irony of the whole thing. A lot of the guys who came up with this, I don't remember which one it was who said this, but he said the primary concern of instituting a code like this is that we not forget that something like propaganda is the biggest enemy here. Something like propaganda, right, is what we don't want. And so they came with an understanding that they weren't going to engage in censorship in order to create propaganda. That's not what they wanted. They were there to help make entertainment better, just pure entertainment. There's nothing wrong with pure entertainment. They understood that. In other words, they want you to tell a good story. They just want you to make better stories. They don't want you to reduce the efficacy of your storytelling muscle so you can go for cheap thrills. They don't want that. They want you to use your muscles as a storyteller and do better than just use bad language and have nudes in your picture.
Mhm.
Or to preach your propaganda, right? And so people can go, yes, yes, that's the thing I agree with. No, they don't want that. They want robust discussion. They want robust ideas, not just indecency, right? So you can see that there's good ideas here. There's good ideas at the foundation of it. There were some bad ideas as well. Some of the code stuff wasn't, I think, very well thought out, and they were pandering to people. Like, for example, Southern Christians, they handed to them by not having interracial relationships in the code. Yeah, how is that important?
Yeah.
Really? That's upholding their own personal cultural standards. And today we wouldn't have those.
Hmm.
So you're not going to see that if we had a code of today, you wouldn't see that. Um, but what they were upholding was things, in addition to that, what they were also upholding was things that make sense. Like they don't want to show doing bad or doing illegal behavior or doing like really lewd behavior and painting that in a good light. Or they don't want to paint criminals in a good light. Well, that
Yeah.
kind of makes sense. Like, why would you want to make, a murderer look good? You know, it makes some sense. Um, sure, in the whole story arc, right? You might want to have an anti-hero in your story, right? So you might begin with making your villain look like a hero. But by the end, the point of your story needs to really come out. And that's maybe to make it more ambiguous or maybe make them fail, right? Because that's a good story, you know? So some people say, for example, that I think it was in the 60s, how the Bonnie and Clyde story was, in a way, the end of the code, right? Because they were showing these two criminals as glorified kind of heroes.
Hmm.
But I don't, maybe that's true. But if it is true, then I think that people might maybe lacked nuance. I mean, they did. It's not like they didn't go out in a blaze of glory, meaning they didn't. It's not like they didn't get shot up and killed by the end. So sure, you can say that's the way they filmed it made them look cool, but I'd say it was more ambiguous than that, really. Um, so on to what happened to the code, right? The code, I think, even though it got attacked by Hollywood, um, the Hollywood naysayers, right? And there literally were like famous actresses who were like, yeah, but my film, we're gonna have as much lewdness as possible because
Wow.
we hope that they will eliminate the worst stuff, but allow some of the medium stuff. So they
Mm.
were literally trying to game the system to oppose it to such a degree that the people who did the code would just be overwhelmed with all the strikes against them and they would just let some of the stuff get by. And so this is the kind of like malicious stuff that Hollywood was doing because they didn't like the code. Um, and they were used to being able to, like some actresses, for example, their whole shtick was lewd, lewd movies, you know? Um, so, in a way, what happened was a good thing, which is that you have two different kinds of movies now. And you have the professional Hollywood films, and you have over here in some dusty bin is like pornography or something. And that's not considered professional work. And so that is kind of a good outcome, right? Because you want to separate the industry based on quality and based on quality of storytelling, you know? Um, and so you want that to occur. You want people to then, for it to be obvious, then, what are you going to that movie for? And this also eliminates the unprofessional stuff from general audience theaters. So that's good. Um, but as it comes to the whole outcome of the Hays Code, sure, it didn't remain. But what it did do was let people know that Americans do have standards, right? And so it transformed into the MPAA. And what happened was the MPAA then gave us the theatrical rating system you see today. And so the rating system in Hollywood is the Hays Code in many ways. That's what it is. It just doesn't have the same, um, check boxes as they had. But what it does have is some standards, right? And so if you go past those standards, it gets turned into a higher rating, an R rating, an X rating, whatever. In NC-17 or whatever was another rating that was there eventually. And so what that does is it lets people be informed of what kind of content is in the picture. And that's a really good thing. Instead of it's just like you come to this picture, get whatever, right? Any person of any age can see this. No, you're actually letting people know, and that's part of the discussion, right, of the film then, is why did this get a PG-13 rating? Like with Steven Spielberg films at the time. His stuff was often they're trying to do G ratings, but they're getting or PG ratings, but they end up getting a PG-13 rating. That's what was going on in like the 80s. So that whole thing creates a discussion, and that discussion allows you to talk about the lewd kind of stuff that might be in this picture. That's good. You want to be aware of that. And I think that's better, right, than something like censorship. I think it's just better than censorship. You want people to be able to do something that's a little bit, you know, um, thought-provoking, right? And so, like an R-rated thing, sure, it's going to have possibly things that they shouldn't see, people shouldn't see, but it's also going to depict like violence in its um disturbing qualities, right? And that has its own message to it. And so you're open to then a variety of types of storytelling. Now you get horror, now you get action to the degree that it's this way, or now you get documentary that doesn't you know, uh that doesn't give you a paint by numbers as it comes to the real world, like it doesn't censor violence or things like that. Because documentary is showing the real world, right? And so these kinds of stories are important sometimes to inform people about the world we live in. And so a lot of these kinds of stories, it's important that artists be able to tell stories that are important, right? And so when there's a pushback like this socially against stories that are lewd, Hollywood needs to understand that it can hit the easy button too often and start engaging in lewd stuff just so people will um watch it for the interesting content but not get really good storytelling, right? So actually this is supposed to be a challenge to the artists of Hollywood to make better art without using bad language or nudity or what have you. And this kind of restriction on an artist can actually challenge them to do better work, right? So we can all get offended about that, but understand that there's a reason for that. And if Hollywood continues to make cheap, tawdry work, people will stop going to theaters. People will stop paying them. And so if you're incentivized by at least by surviving and getting a paycheck, then maybe you should do a little bit better work and maybe more people will see your film. So I mean, in fact, really, we should question our motives when we make art as artists. Are we trying to just spread our own ideology to others? Is that what we're trying to do? Um, as they used to say in Hollywood, If you want a message, go to Western Union. Like that's one of the things they used to say because it's like, we're not here to give you some kind of message. We're here to entertain you and give a good story.
Hmm.
Like we don't know message stuff. What is that stuff? We don't need that. Go to Western Union. But like, um, so Hollywood should understand, right, that there's a larger mission here and that entertainment is not a bad mission, right? It's a valuable thing. And sure, there's going to be levels of messaging in your story. I mean, even entertainment can have just kind of like messaging, like very basic messaging. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but like if you do have messaging, at least don't make it propaganda, right? Don't make it all about the message. Your story is going to suffer for that. And so artists need to think about, well, what is their message? And why are they putting the message so high in the totem pole when they should just have a simple desire to tell good stories and be an artist, right? Instead of just someone who's selling propaganda and selling some kind of ideology. And that's what's happened to Hollywood, right? That's the irony of this whole thing is that the Hays Code understood that they didn't want any of this to lead to propaganda. And now propaganda has changed its shape to such a degree that even the Hays Code can't stop it. It's such a powerful force in Hollywood now that we don't have a Hays Code that could stop it. And so, you get the code and you get propaganda. And sadly, propaganda has won, right? And so unless Hollywood modifies its code of ethics again, and maybe these three ambassadors to Hollywood, Gibson, Stallone, and Jon Voight, if these guys understand their job well, maybe they can inspire Hollywood to be better artists instead of just saying, you guys are a bunch of scumbags and what happened to your sense of decency and America doesn't like you. Instead of just saying that, right? Inspire Hollywood to understand that they've become propagandists. Instead, they should become artists again, right? And if that doesn't happen, I don't know if they're going to make any difference in Hollywood, because it doesn't tend to be that if you send someone from the outside to come regulate you, you just go, okay, I'll do it. That doesn't tend to work. They understood this back then. They understood that Hollywood needed to self-regulate. But now we've come to the point where DC has to come and send ambassadors to regulate from the outside. And so Hollywood really needs to get their stuff together. They've lost their whole history. They've betrayed their own standards to such a degree that their propaganda is like super powered and they got to get knocked down to size by somebody, So, I don't know if this is going to be effective. It might be, but we do know, and I do know though, that the Hays Code did make a difference because people talked about the lewdness in Hollywood. I mean, in the 30s, when the Hays Code was instituted, there was a cultural backlash against the Roaring Twenties. And the Hays Code came from that. So it's not like the Hays Code was some kind of like manufactured thing by a few people. No, this was a groundswell of people that came up and said, we're tired with all the decadence, right? And so that's what's going to happen. Maybe these ambassadors to Hollywood really represent a real groundswell of Americans who are tired of the decadence in Hollywood today. And if it does, if they do represent that, Hollywood's got to listen. And I hope that they're smart enough to do that now. And if not, you know, people can go elsewhere for their entertainment. They don't need to listen to Hollywood. So, yeah. So, hopefully it'll make a difference, but you're very hopeful, and I don't share your hopes either on Gerwig or on that they're going to change from these ambassadors, but it could happen. It could happen. So I hope you're right.
Well, like you said, there's bound to be backlash at some point.
Yeah.
So
We
why
do
not?
need 20,000 men though to stand up and say, I will not watch indecent Hollywood films.
Wow,
And the fact that we don't have that today is bothersome to me.
that's crazy. That was in the 30s.
It was in the 20s, I think, in the late 20s. It could have been in I think well, groundswell movements tend to take time, right? So I think that was late 20s and early 30s where they were I think it's called the League of Decency. You could look it up or
Mhm.
whatever. The League of Decency, they were primarily Catholics who were tired and fed up. And literally, they were like, if a kid was going into a bad movie, there could be a parishioner there going, hey, you're not supposed to be in this movie, kiddo. Like,
Mm,
skedaddle. And so they knew the people in their churches, and they would often even place Catholic like watchdogs at theaters to be like, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. You know? That's what community was doing then. They were
mm.
saying they were really making a difference, standing up and saying, this isn't what we want to see in our theaters. We're going to do something about it. I mean, it's funny that people don't realize how gross a lot of films were back then in the 20s. They were just blatantly like pornographic, you know? We tend to think that society just always is degrading in one direction, and what we forget is that it's always degrading and always reforming. Society is, and then sometimes you just see the reform part of it happening, and sometimes you see the degrading part of it happening, right? But while society over there is reforming, someone in their heart is just degraded over here, and they wish they could be just terrible people. Um, but like and then and then people get tired of it if they see it too much, and they're just like, we have to do something about this. But I do think we need people again to make a stand against Hollywood and say enough's enough, and it shouldn't be just these three guys and Trump. It's got to be a lot more people who are like um canceling their Netflix, canceling, not going to their Warner Brothers movies, not going to see Disney stuff, and even publicly saying some kind of pledge. And that would be even better to just
Yeah.
publicly give a pledge and say I won't do it.
Yeah, I mean, boycotting seems to be a pretty good tactic
Yeah, it can really work.
to get your message across.
But you need it in the thousands and thousands of people. You need like a strong groundswell of people.
Yeah.
Three dudes are not going to be enough, in my view. They're great dudes, don't get me wrong, but you're trying to reform all of Hollywood. I mean, that's a tall order, man.
What are they meant to do?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I don't know. Are they going to give speeches? Are they going to like literally lay out some kind of code? It's up in the air now. I mean, literally, he gave a speech today, and he did appoint them, so to speak, as ambassadors, I think yesterday or the day before. And then today on Trump's inaugural speech, which I think he's going to be president tomorrow, as of tomorrow. On his inaugural speech, he indicated, he mentioned them again. And so it's in the works. I mean, it's happening. We just don't know what they're going to do when they get to Hollywood. And, I mean, it's not like they don't live there already, but so what are they going to do? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I hope that they will study the history of how these things often work so they can learn what to avoid and what to do and what works and what doesn't. I mean, frankly, a lot of the issue isn't just Hollywood, right? It's regular people. Regular people need to know kind of like how bad Hollywood is and that they need if they want things to change, they need to stand up and do something about it. And having better standards is a big part of that. Like identifying what your standards are. That's a pretty important step. So this is one thing too that I hope to talk on in the future because I talk about Exodus out of Hollywood and that the Exodus story is an example of building culture and reforming your society and building a new nation and all these things. And that it's the beginnings of our religion, both of our respective religions, Judaism and Christianity. That's the beginning point, right? And so we have to understand that in order to build something, sometimes you're reforming from something in the past, and often they're the same thing, really. These people who came over from Egypt, they had to reform their lives. And when they weren't willing to do that, they were dying in the desert. So, you know, um, there are things you can learn, right, from the Exodus story about reforming culture and about building new culture. And this is one of them as it comes to art, as it comes to um, how all these forms of art affect culture and how we should respond as a community, as a culture, as a society to art that does not build up and create good culture. How should we respond to that? Right. So those are all important things to learn from this. And I think we need a more robust critics corner, so to speak. Critics who curate and analyze film, analyze art, review art. We need a more robust critics corner because critics no longer judge film based on a standard. They judge film based on their feelings primarily. And that's not where we get our standards from as Christians. So Christians get our standard from an objective standard, and that standard comes from God. It doesn't come from us, right? And so we have to think about um, all those things, or rather compare our standards to what we see in Hollywood. And if you do that, you know, you're going to have something to say about it. And there's going to be a discussion that comes from that. And that can be a very robust discussion as a result. But if you're constantly just talking about your subjective feelings all the time, that's not a very robust discussion. What are you even talking about? Well, I like it. Well, I don't like it. Well, who cares? You just didn't feel good that day. That's not curation. That's not reviewing. That's just saying what your preference is. So, based on your feelings. So, curation has really suffered, right, in the last 20 years or so. And people don't really curate based on standards that are enduring and values laden standards, you know. So that's another thing that we have to discuss, and we will do that at some point. But I have to lay out all those standards and articulate very clearly why those standards should be there. And I've done that a little bit before, but it wasn't to this degree, right? To compare it to culture, to compare it to building culture and all of that. I've just reviewed a few things myself and formed what I thought were some really good standards for that. But going to this next level is another um, story altogether. So um, I had been writing a few reviews on my blog years ago, which is when I started this kind of thing. But yeah, so who knows? Like, I hope things will change from this, and Trump has already made a difference. But we want it to get more, we want things to be more conservative in Hollywood. And we want people to understand, right, that conservatism isn't just a political thing. And it shouldn't just be seen as a political thing. It's uh it's a values thing, right? So we have values based on our belief system, our religion. And that has to seep into, that has to be over placed over our politics, not under our politics, right? Which means you're going to have people on the right wing and conservatives who disagree because they have a different view of religion than the other. And that's normal. There should be that internal discussion, right? About, well, what's the best way to regulate this? What's the best way to, you know, um, regulate Hollywood in this case, right? And what are our standards and why do we have those standards, right? So, yeah, I mean, these are important discussions to have. And sometimes it's the discussion really that's the point of it more than the power to just censor something, right? Because you why? Because you have to have a reason. You have to give an answer to defend your position. And if you can't do that, this is not how these things should work. So there needs to be a rational, logical, understandable reason why something should not be in a movie, right? So hopefully people will start to be, challenge themselves to be able to articulate what their standards really are. Because Hollywood isn't really doing that. What they're doing is just selling their ideology. So, and it's the propaganda has gotten out of control. And as I've stated before, the propaganda in Hollywood is like the propaganda from the faith-based film too. So faith-based film makes just as much propaganda, if not more, than Hollywood itself. And that they both are agenda driven and and at least Hollywood used to be about entertainment, right? But now it seems like both sides are more about propaganda, and that's a problem. So if a Hays Code type thing comes in again, remember what these guys said. We should resist the temptation for a code to create and allow propaganda to flourish. It shouldn't be about that. It should be about making better art, challenging yourself to make better art that's entertaining, that's good storytelling. I don't see why anybody in Hollywood should disagree with that. So yeah, we'll hope for that. And I certainly do. But who knows? It's going to be interesting to watch. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
All right, Rebecca. So any last thoughts?
I was just gonna say, where can people find out more about you, John?
Not fair. No, yeah, you can find me on Media Moses primarily, MediaMoses.com. You can find me on this channel on YouTube, Cultural Warfare with Jon Croft. I'm on X as the Media Moses and on X as John Edward Croft. So, and what about you, Rebecca? Where can we find you?
You can find me posting on Facebook as Rebecca Loves Jesus and on YouTube as Rebecca Loves Jesus and also on Substack, Rebecca Croft.
All right. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see what happens. Maybe Trump will make a difference. Maybe not. We'll see. All right. See you guys next week and enjoy it. Stand up for the culture. That's what I meant to say. All right. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Good.